The night Simone Grant rejected Yoon Tae-Min, she didn't just bruise his ego. She shattered a man trained to never lose. She didn't know he ruled an empire built on blood and silence. She didn't know danger had just memorized her face, or that desire would turn obsession into war. When her past resurfaces and his world closes in, survival will demand impossible choices, and one man powerful enough to destroy everything. Welcome to Afro-KDrama Stories Besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. The rooftop terrace of the Signal Seoul glittered 63 floors above the Han River. 200 of Korea's elite mingled beneath traditional paper lanterns, reimagined in crystal, sipping moet while servers in sleek black hanboks circulated with japchae and tteokbokki, presented like fine art. Tae-Min stood near the glass balustrade overlooking Gangnam's diamond sprawl, surrounded by women who had spent fortunes preparing for this moment. An actress from the latest blockbuster drama touched his Armani sleeve with calculated delicacy. A third-generation chaebol heiress whose family owned half of Myeongdong laughed at words he had not spoken. A socialite in crimson silk cut to blend traditional and modern positioned herself in his sightline like a museum piece. He ignored all of them. His entire focus had locked onto the woman threading through the crowd like she had somewhere better to be. She spoke English into her phone, her American accent cutting through the refined murmur. Her box braids were gathered in an elegant updo that revealed the graceful line of her neck. She wore a black sheath dress that made every other designer gown look desperate. She'd been there 30 minutes and had not glanced his direction once. Tae-Min had watched her decline 3 networking attempts with professional efficiency. She stood near the exit, clearly counting minutes until she could leave without being rude. He had approached with 15 years of practiced precision, the subtle head tilt, the lowered voice, the smile that had opened doors across 3 continents. He had offered her 500 million won for one dinner. She had looked at him with clinical detachment and delivered 12 words that demolished his entire world. Then she had walked to the elevator without looking back. Now Tae-Min stood watching the descending floor numbers, feeling something crack through the ice he had spent 13 years building around anything that mattered. His assistant Min-Jun hovered nearby, wisely silent, recognizing the shift in atmosphere. Tae-Min pulled out his phone and typed a single message to his head of security. He wanted everything about Dr. Simone Grant, where she worked in Seoul, where she lived, why an American therapist had relocated to Korea, what cafe she visited, what time she ran if she ran. He wanted a complete file by dawn. Min-Jun's phone buzzed with calendar cancellations. A month of meetings, acquisitions, galas, obligations that had seemed important 5 minutes ago. The Gangnam district merger, the mayor's fundraiser, his mother's gallery opening. None of it mattered anymore. Because for the first time in his carefully controlled life, Yoon Tae-Min had found something he could not have. And the woman who had just rejected 500 million, won like it was pocket change, had become his full-time obsession. Simone Grant stepped out of the Signal Seoul elevator into the cool November night, finally allowing herself to breathe. The charity gala had been exactly as tedious as she had predicted when her colleague insisted she attend for networking purposes. Wealthy people pretending to care about causes while calculating social advantages over overpriced champagne. She had stayed the obligatory 90 minutes, made polite conversation with 3 potential corporate clients, and successfully avoided the aggressive networking that made these events exhausting. The man who had approached her with the money offer had been the final straw. 500 million won for dinner. The audacity would have been almost impressive if it had not been so deeply insulting. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant Ji-woo asking how the event went. Simone typed back a brief response about potential client leads, while her driver navigated through Gangnam's late-night traffic toward her apartment in Itaewon. Seoul had been home for 3 years now, ever since she had walked away from her prestigious New York practice and the wreckage of her personal life. The move had been strategic, necessary, and ultimately healing. Here, she ran the Itaewon Wellness Center, a boutique therapy practice specializing in trauma recovery and narcissistic abuse. Her client list included diplomats' wives recognizing emotionally abusive marriages, executives identifying toxic patterns, and young women escaping relationships like the one that had nearly destroyed her. Devin Mitchell had been a master manipulator wrapped in Ivy League degrees and generational wealth. 5 years of systematic gaslighting, isolation, and control disguised as love. 2 years of therapy and a restraining order to finally break free. That experience had transformed her practice. She had become an expert in manipulation tactics, studying the precise mechanisms charming men use to weaponize appeal. She taught clients to recognize love bombing, intermittent reinforcement, manufactured scarcity, and the subtle nonverbal cues that created false intimacy, which was exactly why the man at the Senial had been so remarkably transparent. The calculated head tilt, the lowered voice triggering protective instincts, the financial offer designed to simultaneously impress and obligate. She had cataloged every tactic within 30 seconds. Men like him were her specialty, wealthy, powerful, accustomed to charm opening every door, the kind who viewed rejection as challenge rather than boundary. Her phone buzzed again as she entered her apartment. Ji-woo working late as always with a message that made Simone's blood run cold. Emergency. A client just paid $500,000 for tomorrow's first appointment slot. Insists on seeing only you. Says he has an obsession problem. Name is Yoon Tae-Min. Simone stared at Ji-woo's text message for a full minute before her professional training kicked in past the shock. Yoon Tae-Min had somehow discovered where she worked, identified her specialty, and paid an amount of money that suggested this was not going away quietly. She typed back quickly. Confirm the appointment for 9 tomorrow morning. Standard intake protocol. And Ji-woo, if he shows up early or tries to reschedule for today, the answer is no. Her assistant's response came immediately. Already done. He specifically requested first appointment of the day. Should I be concerned? Simone considered the question while unlocking her apartment door. She had dealt with persistent clients before, people who confused therapeutic boundaries with personal rejection, but none of them had possessed the resources or determination of someone like Yoon Tae-Min. Not concerned, just prepared. See you at 8:30. She set her phone down and moved through her evening routine with deliberate calm. Shower, chamomile tea, 30 minutes of reading clinical journals instead of dwelling on tomorrow's session. This was just another client with just another presenting problem. The fact that he had offered her $500,000 at a party was irrelevant to the professional relationship, except she knew that was a lie. Sleep came in fragments. She kept seeing his expression at the Senial, the moment after she had rejected him. Not anger or embarrassment, but something closer to fascination, like she had done something he genuinely had not anticipated, and the novelty of it had captured his complete attention. Men like him did not respond well to novelty wearing off. Morning arrived with Seoul's usual chaos of traffic and construction noise filtering through her windows. Simone dressed in her standard consultation uniform, tailored black pants, silk blouse, minimal jewelry, professional armor that communicated competence and boundaries in equal measure. She arrived at the Itaewon Wellness Center at 8:15, giving herself time to prepare the consultation room and review her approach. Ji-woo was already there, looking slightly anxious in a way that meant she had probably spent her own sleepless night worrying about this appointment. The session room was ready, comfortable chairs angled for conversation, soft lighting, tea service, everything designed to create safety for people who had learned safety was conditional. Simone sat at her desk reviewing her intake questionnaire when Ji-woo's voice came through the intercom at exactly 9 o'clock. He is here. 2 words that somehow carried the weight of inevitability. Simone took one steadying breath, opened her office door, and found Yoon Tae-Min standing in her waiting room wearing a charcoal suit and an expression she had not seen at the party. No practiced charm. No calculated smile. He looked almost nervous, which she immediately catalogued as a potential manipulation tactic before gesturing him inside without a word. Simone closed the door behind Yoon Tae-Min and returned to her seat with the measured calm of someone who had spent years learning to mask every genuine reaction. He remained standing for a moment, studying the room with an attention to detail that suggested he was cataloging every element for future reference. The consultation space had been designed with intention. Soft gray walls that reduced visual stress, chairs positioned at angles that encouraged openness without forcing eye contact, a small succulent garden on the windowsill that clients often focused on when discussing difficult topics. Natural light filtered through sheer curtains, creating an atmosphere of safety that had taken her 3 years to perfect. He finally sat down, and the movement was different from the controlled grace she had observed at the Signal party. There was hesitation in it, an almost imperceptible uncertainty that either meant he was genuinely uncomfortable or extraordinarily skilled at manufacturing authenticity. Simone opened her intake file and began the standard assessment protocol without preamble. She explained confidentiality parameters, session structure, and the limitations of what therapy could provide. Her voice remained professionally neutral, the same tone she used with every new client, regardless of how they had arrived in her office. Tae-Min listened without interruption, his dark eyes tracking her face with an intensity that would have unsettled most people. She had learned to recognize predatory attention versus genuine focus, and his fell somewhere disturbingly between both categories. When she finished the procedural explanation, she set down her pen and waited. The silence that followed was deliberate. People revealed themselves most honestly in the spaces between words, when the pressure to fill emptiness overrode their carefully constructed presentations. He broke first, which surprised her. What emerged was not the entitled pursuit she had anticipated. He described 15 years of systematic training in manipulation techniques. His father had hired consultants who taught him how to read micro-expressions, mirror body language, modulate vocal tone for maximum impact, how to make anyone feel like the most important person in any room, how to identify what people wanted and become the perfect provider of that specific need. Charm as weapon, relationships as transactions, vulnerability as strategic performance rather than genuine exposure. He explained that he had become so proficient at the performance that he no longer knew which parts of his personality were authentic and which were engineered responses. Every interaction was calculated. Every smile had purpose. Every conversation was a chess game he had been trained to win. The exhaustion in his voice sounded real, but Simone had heard skilled manipulators manufacture exhaustion before. Devon had been a master at weaponizing vulnerability, using confessions of his own pain to justify the pain he inflicted on others. What made her pause was his admission about the Signal party. He explained that her complete immunity to his tactics had been genuinely disorienting. For the first time in over a decade, his entire arsenal had failed. Not because she was playing a different game, but because she had refused to play at all. He was not here to pursue her romantically, he claimed. He wanted to understand the mechanism of her resistance and possibly learn whether someone who had spent 15 years becoming a perfect performance could ever access anything genuine underneath. Simone watched him carefully throughout, cataloging every micro-expression, every shift in posture, every pause that might indicate deception. Her clinical training screamed that this was an elaborate manipulation. Her instincts whispered something more complicated. She had built her entire practice on helping people escape men exactly like him. But she had never encountered one who seemed aware of what he was and genuinely exhausted by the performance. Her next question would determine whether this was therapy or something far more dangerous. Simone spent the next 72 hours doing what she always did when facing a professional decision that felt uncomfortably personal. She reviewed case studies, consulted peer-reviewed research on narcissistic personality adaptations, and created a detailed risk assessment matrix that would have impressed her most rigorous graduate school professors. The clinical evidence suggested proceeding with extreme caution. Clients who presented with manufactured vulnerability often escalated when their initial strategy failed to achieve desired results. The pattern was well documented: confession as seduction, weaponized authenticity, strategic self-disclosure designed to create false intimacy and lower therapeutic boundaries. Every marker pointed toward classic manipulation, except for 3 details that refused to align with the expected pattern. First, Yoon Tae-Min had not attempted contact since leaving her office. No flowers, no messages, no casual encounters that would allow him to gauge her response. Most manipulators intensified pressure after an emotional confession, testing whether the vulnerability had created the intended opening. His complete silence suggested either remarkable patience or genuine respect for professional boundaries. Second, her background investigation had revealed something unexpected. 5 years ago, Tae-Min had quietly funded a therapeutic program for children of high-pressure families in Korea. The initiative provided counseling for young people being groomed for corporate dynasties, helping them process the psychological cost of performance-based childhoods. The program operated anonymously through a foundation that took significant measures to hide his involvement. People who viewed therapy as manipulation rarely invested millions in making it accessible to others. Third, and most troubling to her carefully constructed skepticism, was her own emotional response. She had spent 3 years building expertise in recognizing when her judgment was being compromised. Devin had taught her to question every instinct that whispered someone might be different, might be worth the risk, might actually mean what they claimed. But her reaction to Tae-Min was not the nervous flutter of attraction or the dangerous pull of wanting to fix someone broken. It was clinical curiosity coupled with something closer to recognition. She had seen genuine exhaustion in his expression, the kind that came from years of performing without respite. She understood that particular fatigue in ways that made her profoundly uncomfortable. On the 4th morning after their session, Simone made her decision. She would accept him as a client under specific conditions: 6 months of weekly sessions, standard therapeutic protocols with reinforced boundaries. The moment his behavior suggested manipulation rather than genuine therapeutic engagement, she would terminate immediately and refer him elsewhere. She would treat this exactly like the professional challenge it was, not the personal risk her instincts kept whispering it might become. She drafted the email outlining her terms and sent it before she could reconsider. His response arrived within minutes, which suggested he had been waiting for her answer with the kind of focused attention that should have concerned her more than it did. He accepted every condition without negotiation. Their first official session was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 9 a.m, and Simone spent the intervening days preparing with the thoroughness of someone who knew that her professional judgment and personal safety might both depend on correctly assessing what kind of man Yoon Tae-Min actually was underneath 15 years of systematic performance. She did not yet know that her careful preparation would become completely irrelevant within the next 72 hours, when a message from New York would arrive that would transform this from a therapeutic challenge into something far more dangerous. Devin Mitchell had discovered where she was. The message arrived through her professional email at 2 a.m, which meant Devin had either hired someone to find her or never stopped tracking her movements in the 3 years since she had disappeared from New York. The subject line contained only her old name, the one she had legally changed after the restraining order: Amara. He knew where she worked. He knew she had built a practice specializing in abuse recovery, which he would certainly view as a personal insult. He knew she was in Seoul, and the message made clear he knew exactly which neighborhood, which building, which floor. The email itself was a masterpiece of calculated menace wrapped in the language of concern. He missed her. He had changed. He understood now why she had needed space, and he respected that growth process. He happened to be in Seoul for business next month and thought perhaps they could have coffee just to talk, just to find closure for both of them. Every word was carefully chosen to sound reasonable to anyone who might later read it as evidence. Every sentence was designed to remind her that he could find her anywhere, that distance meant nothing, that the safety she had built was an illusion he could shatter whenever he chose. Simone sat in her darkened apartment staring at the screen until her eyes burned. The old fear tried to resurface, the muscle memory of 3 years spent walking on eggshells, monitoring his moods, trying to anticipate which version of him would appear each day. The hypervigilance that had nearly destroyed her mental health before she finally escaped. But she was not the same woman who had fled New York in the middle of the night with 2 suitcases and a new identity. She had spent 3 years rebuilding herself, studying the exact mechanisms Devon had used to control her, teaching other women how to recognize and escape the same patterns. She would not let him take that away. By dawn, Simone had formulated a plan. She would document everything. Screenshot the email, note the implicit threats, establish a paper trail that could support legal action if necessary. She would inform her building security. She would vary her routes to work. She would implement every safety protocol she had spent years teaching her clients. What she would not do was run again. Her phone buzzed with a reminder about her 9 o'clock appointment, Yoon Tae-Min's first official therapy session. The timing was almost darkly comedic. She was about to spend an hour helping a man learn to be less manipulative, while Devon's message sat in her inbox like a ticking bomb. Simone showered, dressed in her standard professional armor, and left for the office with the hyper-awareness of someone who knew she was potentially being watched. Every person on the subway became a potential threat. Every camera made her skin crawl with the knowledge that Devon had resources she could not match. She arrived at the Itaewon Wellness Center 30 minutes early and immediately pulled up Seoul's legal resources for foreign nationals dealing with harassment. South Korea had stalking laws. She could file a report. She could build a case. But she knew from experience that restraining orders were just paper, and men like Devon viewed legal boundaries as challenges rather than deterrents. Ji-woo arrived with coffee and noticed immediately that something was wrong. Simone deflected with practiced ease, claiming she had simply slept poorly. Her assistant accepted the explanation with visible concern, but did not push. At precisely 9 o'clock, her intercom buzzed. Yoon Tae-Min had arrived for his session, and Simone was about to spend an hour maintaining professional composure while her entire carefully constructed life threatened to collapse around her. She had no way of knowing that the man in her waiting room was about to become either her greatest mistake or her only real protection against the nightmare that had just found her again. Simone opened her office door to find Yoon Tae-Min wearing a simple black sweater and dark jeans instead of his usual tailored suits. The change felt deliberate, like he was attempting to strip away performance elements. Whether genuine progress or another manipulation remained unclear. He entered without studied grace, moving with ordinary human uncertainty. She gestured to the chair, acutely aware that her clinical detachment was compromised by Devon's message still burning in her mind. Professional compartmentalization had always been her strength. Today, that skill felt dangerously fragile, like holding water in shaking hands. She began her standard check-in protocol. His response came without careful verbal choreography. He described feeling disoriented after their previous session, like someone had held up a mirror showing him what he had avoided seeing for 15 years. The discomfort appeared genuine, but Simone's ability to trust her assessment felt fundamentally damaged. If she could not recognize Devon's danger until already trapped, how could she accurately evaluate whether Tae-Min's vulnerability was real? She caught herself spiraling and forced attention back to the present. This was exactly what Devon wanted, to make her doubt herself, to undermine her rebuilt confidence, to remind her that safety was conditional. Tae-Min described a specific adolescent incident when his father brought in a consultant to teach him how to cry on command. By 17, he could manufacture tears that made business rivals accept unfavorable terms. The detail felt impossible to fabricate, either truth about systematic abuse or extraordinary skill at believable lies. She realized he had stopped speaking and was watching her with an expression suggesting he had asked an unheard question. Her concentration was fracturing visibly. Simone made a split-second decision violating every professional boundary. She explained in neutral terms that she had received a concerning message that morning from someone in her past, that it had affected her focus more than anticipated. The shift in his demeanor was immediate and total. Uncertainty disappeared, replaced by something dangerous. His questions came fast and precise. Who contacted her? Whether she felt safe, whether the threat was specific or implied. His next offer confirmed her concern. He had resources that could make this situation disappear. People who specialized in making problems go away permanently and legally. The offer was terrifying because part of her desperately wanted to say yes. Simone's therapeutic training screamed that accepting help from a client represented a catastrophic boundary violation that could destroy both the professional relationship and her clinical judgment. The power dynamic would shift irreversibly. She would become indebted to someone she was supposed to be helping, creating exactly the kind of entanglement that left therapists vulnerable to manipulation. Every ethical guideline she had studied explicitly prohibited this scenario. But those guidelines had been written by people who had never received a message from their abuser at 2 a.m, who had never spent 3 years looking over their shoulder, wondering when the illusion of safety would shatter, who had never fled across an ocean only to discover that distance meant nothing to someone with enough money and obsession. She told Tae-Min that his offer was inappropriate and that she needed time to consider how this revelation would affect their therapeutic relationship going forward, that perhaps they should pause their sessions until she could consult with a supervisor about whether continuing was ethically viable given this boundary breach. His response was immediate and uncompromising. He understood her professional concerns, but those concerns were secondary to her physical safety. He was not offering help as her client, but as someone who recognized genuine danger and had resources she did not. She could terminate their therapy immediately if necessary, but she would accept his protection whether their professional relationship continued or not. The presumption in his words should have triggered every alarm system she possessed. This was exactly how control began, deciding what she needed without her consent, overriding her professional judgment with his certainty, framing protection as non-negotiable rather than optional. Except he was also completely right about the danger. Devon had found her once, which meant he could find her again. Her building security consisted of a single guard who watched television during night shifts. Her restraining order from New York had no jurisdiction in South Korea. She had no family here, limited connections, and an ex-abuser who viewed her escape as a personal challenge that required correction. Simone stood and moved to her office window overlooking the Itaewon Street below. Pedestrians moved through their morning routines, completely unaware that somewhere among them could be someone Devon had hired to watch her movements, to document her patterns, to report back on the life she had built. She turned back to find Tae-Min watching her with an expression that contained none of his usual calculated charm. He looked almost grim, like someone preparing for a conflict he knew was coming, whether she accepted his help or not. The professional part of her brain recognized she was standing at a decision point that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of everything that followed. The terrified part that still remembered Devon's hands around her throat during their final argument recognized she might not survive refusing. She asked what his protection would actually entail. His answer made her realize she was about to step into a world where the rules she had relied on for 3 years would become completely irrelevant. Tae-Min's protection plan was comprehensive enough to be reassuring and invasive enough to be terrifying. 24-hour security detail positioned at discreet distances, background checks on everyone in her building, monitoring of her professional email and phone for additional contact from Devon, a security upgrade for her apartment that would require her landlord's approval, which he would handle through channels she probably did not want to understand. Most significantly, he would have Devon investigated thoroughly. Financial records, business dealings, current location, travel plans, everything that would allow them to anticipate his movements and prepare appropriate countermeasures. The word countermeasures made Simone's stomach tighten with implications she chose not to examine too closely. She found herself negotiating terms like this was a business contract rather than her accepting protection from a client whose psychological stability she was supposed to be professionally evaluating. No armed guards, nothing that would draw attention or make her clients uncomfortable, updates twice weekly maximum unless the threat level changed, and absolutely no action taken against Devon without her explicit approval. Tae-Min agreed to everything except the final term. He would not promise to consult her before responding to direct threats. If Devon showed up in Seoul, if he approached her building, if he made any move that suggested immediate danger, Tae-Min's people would act first and inform her after. She should have walked away, should have recognized that accepting these terms meant surrendering control over her own safety to someone she barely knew, should have seen the pattern of a powerful man deciding what was best for her without her full consent. Instead, she heard herself agreeing because the alternative was facing Devon alone, and 3 years of therapy had not erased the muscle memory of how that ended last time. The session concluded with an arrangement that had nothing to do with therapy and everything to do with survival. Tae-Min would have his head of security contact her within the hour to coordinate logistics. She would forward Devon's email and any subsequent messages. She would vary her schedule and routes as an additional precaution. He left her office looking less like a client and more like someone who had just acquired a responsibility he took very seriously. Simone sat in the empty consultation room afterward, trying to catalog exactly how many ethical violations she had just committed, and whether any of them mattered compared to staying alive. Her phone buzzed 30 minutes later with a message from an unknown number. Brief introduction from someone named Kang Min-seo, head of security for Yoon Tae-Min's operations, requesting her current location for immediate assessment and a meeting to discuss protection protocols. She responded with her office address and watched through her window as a black sedan pulled up within 10 minutes. A woman in her late 30s emerged, moving with the controlled awareness of someone with serious training. Former military, Simone guessed. Possibly intelligence services. Min-seo's assessment of the building took less than 5 minutes. The ground floor access was inadequate. The rear entrance was completely unsecured. The parking garage had blind spots that would allow someone to wait undetected for hours. She needed to relocate immediately, Min-seo explained, preferably to a building with controlled access and comprehensive security systems. Tae-Min owned several properties in Itaewon that would be suitable. She could move her practice or maintain it here with appropriate security enhancements, but her residence needed to change today. Simone realized with a strange detachment that she had agreed to protection and somehow ended up being told to move out of her apartment by a woman she had met 10 minutes ago. This was how it began. How good intentions became control. How protection became possession. But Devon's email sat in her inbox, and the alternative was pretending she could handle this alone. Simone moved into one of Tae-Min's Itaewon properties at 7 that evening with the efficiency of someone who had practiced emergency relocations before. 2 security personnel she had never met packed her apartment, while Min-seo explained that her new residence occupied the entire 4th floor of a building, with biometric access, reinforced doors, and surveillance systems that would make a diplomatic compound jealous. The apartment was 3 times larger than her previous space, decorated in minimalist luxury that made her secondhand furniture look absurd by comparison. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Seoul's glittering skyline. The kitchen contained appliances she did not know how to operate. The bathroom had a soaking tub that could fit 4 people. She stood in the middle of this excess, feeling like she had somehow agreed to witness protection without committing any actual crime. Min Seo handed her new key cards, explained the security protocols, and mentioned almost casually that Tae-Min's penthouse occupied the floor directly above. For coordination purposes, she clarified when Simone's expression must have revealed her concern. He would not intrude on her space, but proximity allowed for faster response if circumstances required immediate intervention. The implications hung in the air like smoke. She was now living in a building owned by her client, 1 floor below him, surrounded by his security personnel, completely dependent on systems he controlled. Every instinct screamed that she had made a catastrophic mistake. Except Devon's email remained in her inbox, and Min Seo's assessment of her previous building's vulnerabilities had been accurate enough to make her skin crawl. The rear entrance had been unlocked. Anyone could have walked in, could have been waiting in the stairwell, could have known her schedule and her patterns because she had been too focused on rebuilding her life to remember that some people never stopped hunting. Her phone buzzed with a message from Ji-woo asking if everything was okay. Simone had texted earlier about a last-minute apartment issue requiring immediate relocation. Her assistant had responded with concern and an offer to help that Simone had declined for reasons she could not fully explain. How did she tell Ji-woo that she had moved into her client's building? That she had accepted protection from someone she was supposed to be therapeutically treating? That every professional boundary she had established was disintegrating faster than she could rationalize the necessity? She responded with vague reassurance and set her phone down before guilt could overwhelm her. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Min Seo stood in the doorway with takeout from a restaurant Simone had never afforded. Tae-Min had arranged dinner, assuming she would be too overwhelmed to manage food herself. The presumption should have angered her. Instead, she felt dangerously close to tears because he was right, and being correctly anticipated felt like the beginning of losing herself entirely. If you want to see whether the Mafia boss's protection will save her or trap her forever, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Sleep refused to come in the unfamiliar luxury of her new apartment. Simone lay in a bed that felt too large, staring at ceiling lights from buildings she could not name, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a space that was not hers. The silence felt oppressive in ways her previous apartment's thin walls and neighbor noise never had. There she could hear life happening around her. Here the soundproofing created an isolation that made her hyper-aware of her own breathing. Her phone showed 2:30 in the morning when she finally gave up and moved to the living room. The floor-to-ceiling windows revealed Seoul still glittering with activity, indifferent to her crisis of professional ethics and personal safety. She made tea in the pristine kitchen, feeling like an intruder in someone else's carefully curated life. The apartment came fully furnished, which meant every piece had been selected by Tae-Min or someone he had hired. She was living inside his aesthetic choices, his idea of what constituted appropriate comfort, his vision of what she needed. The thought made her skin crawl with the familiar sensation of her autonomy being systematically eroded. This was exactly how it had started with Devon. Small decisions made on her behalf, gifts that were too generous to refuse, gradual encroachment on her independence disguised as care and concern. By the time she recognized the pattern, she'd been so entangled in his version of her life that extracting herself required abandoning everything she had built. She was doing it again. Different man, different country, different justification. But the fundamental dynamic felt sickeningly familiar. Except Tae-Min was not Devon. He had not isolated her from friends or undermined her career. He had not gaslit her or manipulated her emotions. He had offered protection she genuinely needed against a threat that was undeniably real. The fact that his protection came with strings did not automatically make him abusive. Or perhaps that was exactly the rationalization that every person in a controlling relationship told themselves. Her phone buzzed with an incoming message, startling her badly enough that she dropped the tea mug. It shattered across the marble floor in a spray of ceramic and liquid that she stared at with disproportionate distress. She could not even break something in this apartment without it feeling like a violation of space that was not truly hers. The message was from an unknown number, brief and clinical. Security report from Min Seo. No suspicious activity detected around her previous building or current location. Devin Mitchell's last known location was New York as of 18 hours ago. Monitoring continued. Updates would follow if circumstances changed. The efficiency should have been reassuring. Instead, it reminded her that she was now part of a surveillance apparatus she had not chosen and could not control. People she did not know were tracking her movements, monitoring her communications, making decisions about her safety without her input. A soft sound from above made her freeze. Footsteps crossing the floor directly overhead. Tae-Min was awake at 2:30 in the morning, moving through his penthouse while she sat one floor below, surrounded by the protection he had insisted she needed. She wondered if he knew she was awake. If his security systems included monitoring that would alert him to movement in her apartment. If the privacy she thought she had was another illusion in a situation built entirely on his terms. The broken mug lay scattered across the floor like evidence of her unraveling composure. Simone knelt to gather the pieces, feeling the sharp edges bite into her fingers with a clarity that cut through the surreal disconnection of everything that had happened in the past 48 hours. She was living in a building owned by her client, accepting protection that came with unmeasurable obligation, losing the boundaries that had kept her professionally functional and personally safe for 3 years. And somewhere in New York, Devin was planning his next move, completely unaware that running from him had landed her in a situation that might be equally dangerous in entirely different ways. Morning arrived with Seoul's filtered sunlight and a realization that Simone had somehow fallen asleep on the living room floor beside the cleaned-up tea shards. Her neck protested the awkward angle, and her professional composure felt as fractured as the mug she had broken hours earlier. Her phone showed 6 missed messages, 3 from Ji-woo confirming client appointments, 1 from Min Seo with another security update, 2 from a number she did not recognize but suspected belonged to Tae-Min, checking if she had settled in adequately. She ignored all of them and showered in the palatial bathroom, trying to reclaim some sense of control through the familiar routine of preparing for work. The mirror reflected someone who looked haunted despite the luxury surroundings, and Simone recognized the expression from 3 years ago when escaping. Devin had felt simultaneously necessary and impossible. The Itaewon Wellness Center felt like returning to solid ground after days adrift. Her consultation room remained exactly as she had left it, untouched by the chaos that had consumed her personal life. Ji-woo greeted her with concern that Simone deflected through practiced professionalism, and her morning clients provided the structure she desperately needed. By afternoon, she had almost convinced herself that she could maintain the compartmentalization. Work was work. Her living situation was temporary necessity. The boundaries were blurred but not destroyed. Then Tae-Min arrived for his scheduled session, and the carefully constructed separation collapsed entirely. He entered her office looking like he had slept as poorly as she had, which should not have been visible on someone who spent 15 years perfecting performance. The careful facade was slipping in ways that felt either genuine or strategically calculated to appear genuine, and Simone no longer trusted her ability to distinguish between the two. She began with the obvious question. How did he expect therapy to continue when she was now living in his building, dependent on his protection, entangled in his world in ways that violated every professional boundary? His response was characteristically direct. He understood the ethical complications, but her safety took precedence over therapeutic protocol. If she needed to terminate their sessions to maintain professional integrity, he would accept that decision without argument. But the protection would continue regardless because the threat was real and his resources were available whether or not she was his therapist. The logic was infuriating in its reasonableness. Simone found herself explaining something she had not fully articulated even to herself. That accepting protection from him created a debt she could not repay. That living in his building eroded her autonomy in ways that felt dangerously similar to patterns she had spent years learning to recognize and escape. That his benevolent control was still control, and her dependence made genuine therapeutic objectivity impossible. He listened without interruption, and when she finished, his question cut straight through her professional armor. Did she actually believe he would use her current vulnerability against her? Or was she projecting Devon's patterns onto someone who had given her no concrete reason to distrust his stated intentions? The question hung between them like a challenge and an accusation, because he was right. She had no evidence that Tae-Min intended harm, no indication that his protection was anything other than what he claimed, no proof that her instinctive distrust was based on his actual behavior rather than her traumatized hypervigilance, seeing threats in every act of care. But Devon had given her no early warning signs either, not until she was already trapped. Her next words would determine whether she continued therapy with someone who now held significant power over her life circumstances, or whether she drew a boundary that might be professionally necessary but personally catastrophic. Simone made a decision that felt simultaneously reckless and necessary. She would continue their therapeutic relationship with explicit modifications. Sessions would focus exclusively on his stated goals of understanding manipulation patterns and accessing authentic emotional responses. Any discussion of her personal safety or living arrangements was off limits during therapy time. She would accept his protection as a separate arrangement that existed outside their professional work. The compartmentalization was imperfect and probably unsustainable, but it allowed her to maintain the illusion of professional boundaries while acknowledging the reality that her safety depended on resources he provided. Tae-Min agreed without negotiation, which itself felt suspicious. Men who truly wanted control rarely accepted limitations so readily. Either he was genuinely respecting her boundaries, or he was skilled enough to recognize when pushing would be counterproductive. She chose to proceed as if his acceptance was genuine, because the alternative was paralysis. Their session continued with surprising productivity. He described a recent business negotiation where he had caught himself deploying manipulation tactics automatically, then stopped mid-conversation to acknowledge what he was doing. The other party had been so disoriented by the honesty that they had agreed to terms more favorable than what Tae-Min's manipulation would have achieved. The anecdote suggested either genuine progress or a perfectly crafted story designed to convince her that therapy was working. Simone recognized she was trapped in a spiral of distrust that would make effective therapy impossible if she could not find some foundation of provisional belief. She made a conscious choice to take his reported progress at face value while maintaining clinical skepticism about long-term patterns. By the session's end, they had established a fragile equilibrium. Professional relationship continued with modifications. Protection remained separate. Trust would be provisional and constantly reevaluated. It felt like negotiating a ceasefire in a war where neither party was entirely certain who the enemy was. The rest of her week settled into an uncomfortable routine. Work provided structure and purpose. Her new apartment became slightly less alien as she added small personal touches that made the space feel marginally hers. Minseo's security reports arrived with mechanical regularity, each one confirming that Devon remained in New York but showed signs of travel planning. The threat was patient, waiting, building towards something Simone could feel approaching like a storm system visible on the horizon. Friday evening brought an unexpected complication that shattered her carefully maintained compartmentalization. Ji-woo mentioned during their end-of-week check-in that she had been approached by someone claiming to be an old friend of Simone's from New York. The man had been charming and persistent, asking questions about Simone's schedule and current living situation. Ji-woo had deflected politely, but felt uncomfortable enough to mention it. The description matched someone Simone had never met, but recognized instantly from Devon's social circle. He was sending people to investigate, to gather information, to find vulnerabilities in the protection she had accepted. Her hands were shaking when she called Min Seo to report the contact. The response was immediate and chilling in its efficiency. The individual would be identified, his movements tracked, and appropriate measures taken to ensure he understood that further investigation would have consequences. Simone did not ask what consequences meant because she was not certain she wanted to know. That evening, Tae-Min appeared at her door without invitation or warning. His expression carried none of the calculated charm from their early interactions. He looked genuinely concerned in ways that bypassed her defensive skepticism entirely. He'd been informed about the contact with Ji-woo. His security team was handling the immediate threat, but they needed to discuss escalation protocols because Devon was clearly moving faster than anticipated. Standing in her doorway, accepting his presence in her personal space, Simone realized that the boundaries she had tried so carefully to maintain were already gone. The war she had been trying to avoid was here. Tae-Min entered her apartment with the controlled urgency of someone managing a crisis, and Simone found herself too exhausted to protest the boundary violation. They needed to discuss immediate security adjustments, he explained, and her office was not secure enough for the conversation. The irony of feeling unsafe in her own therapeutic space was not lost on her. Min Seo arrived within minutes carrying a tablet that displayed surveillance footage Simone had not known existed. The man who had approached Ji-woo had been photographed at 3 different locations near the Itaewon Wellness Center over the past week. He had established patterns, documented routines, and made inquiries at nearby businesses about the building's security measures. This was not casual curiosity. This was reconnaissance. Devon was planning something specific, and he had sent someone competent to gather intelligence. The realization made Simone's carefully maintained composure fracture in ways she could not hide. Her breathing became shallow. Her hands trembled despite her attempts at control. The clinical detachment she relied on professionally dissolved under the weight of understanding that her worst fear was actively unfolding. Tae-Min's response was immediate and surprisingly gentle. He guided her to sit down, his hand on her shoulder, carrying none of the presumption she might have expected. He waited until her breathing steadied before continuing the conversation, and the patience felt genuine in ways that bypassed her defenses entirely. The security recommendations were comprehensive and invasive. She needed to suspend her practice temporarily or relocate it to a more secure facility. Her daily routines required complete disruption. Her contact with anyone outside Tae-Min's security network needed monitoring to prevent additional infiltration attempts. Every suggestion was reasonable given the threat level. Every recommendation also represented another piece of her autonomy surrendered to systems she did not control. Simone heard herself agreeing because the alternative was pretending she could handle this alone, and the surveillance footage had destroyed that particular delusion. Min Seo left to implement the immediate security changes, and Simone found herself alone with Tae-Min in an apartment that suddenly felt smaller, despite its excessive square footage. The intimacy of the moment was unavoidable. He had seen her panic, had witnessed the fear she spent enormous energy concealing from everyone, including herself, had responded with care that felt divorced from manipulation. She found herself asking the question that had been building since she first accepted his protection. Why was he doing this? The therapy sessions did not justify this level of resource investment. Her safety was not his responsibility. The threat to her did not impact his business or reputation. What did he actually gain from involving himself so deeply in her crisis? His answer was characteristically direct and completely destabilizing. He explained that watching someone be threatened by an abusive ex while possessing the resources to help and choosing not to act would have made him complicit in whatever Devon ultimately did. That his father had taught him manipulation, but his mother had taught him that power without purpose was just cruelty. That being able to help someone who genuinely needed protection and refusing because it was inconvenient would have made him exactly the kind of person he was trying to stop being. The vulnerability in his voice sounded real, but Simone's trust had been so thoroughly demolished by Devon that she could not fully accept apparent genuineness without suspecting performance. Yet he had not asked for anything in return, had not leveraged her dependence, had not suggested that his protection came with expectations beyond her safety. She wanted desperately to believe that was meaningful. The question was whether her want was based on evidence or simply exhaustion from being afraid. Simone suspended her practice the following Monday with an explanation to her clients about unforeseen personal circumstances requiring temporary closure. The professional devastation of abandoning people who depended on her therapeutic support felt almost as acute as the fear driving the decision. She had spent 3 years building trust with women escaping abuse, and now she was disappearing exactly when they needed consistency most. The irony of becoming unavailable to abuse survivors while fleeing her own abuser was not lost on her. Jiwoo handled the logistics with characteristic efficiency and visible concern that Simone deflected with vague reassurances about everything being temporary. Her assistant deserved honesty, but received carefully constructed half-truths because the full reality was too complicated to explain without revealing how thoroughly her professional boundaries had collapsed. Tae-Min arranged for her client files to be transferred to a colleague whose practice specialized in similar work. The efficiency with which he solved problems that would have taken her weeks to coordinate reminded Simone of both his resources and her growing dependence on them. She was losing the ability to manage her own crisis without his intervention. The realization should have terrified her more than it did. Her days contracted into a strange liminal existence. The apartment became both sanctuary and prison. Minseo's security reports arrived with mechanical regularity, each one tracking Devon's movements with precision that suggested surveillance Simone preferred not to examine too closely. He had booked a flight to Seoul, departing in 9 days. The countdown felt inevitable, like watching a natural disaster approach with no ability to alter its trajectory. Tae-Min's therapy sessions continued in her apartment since her office was no longer accessible. The location shift destroyed the last pretense of professional boundaries. They sat in her living room discussing his manipulation patterns while his security team monitored her building and his resources funded her entire existence. The therapeutic relationship had become a fiction they both maintained because abandoning it would require acknowledging how completely their dynamic had transformed into something neither of them knew how to categorize. During their Thursday session, something shifted in ways that crossed lines Simone had been desperately trying to preserve. He had been describing a childhood memory of his mother intervening when his father's training became abusive. She had been the only person who saw through the performance his father demanded and loved the frightened child underneath. Her death, when he was 19, had removed the last person who knew his authentic self. The raw grief in his voice was either genuine or the most sophisticated manipulation Simone had ever witnessed. She found herself responding not as his therapist, but as someone who understood the particular devastation of losing the one person who saw past carefully constructed defenses. Her own mother had died 2 years before she met Devon, leaving her without the support system that might have helped her recognize the warning signs earlier. They were sharing grief as equals rather than therapist and client, and the intimacy felt dangerous in its authenticity. Simone realized she had been gradually letting her guard down, not through any specific decision, but through the accumulated weight of his consistency. He had not leveraged her dependence, had not demanded anything beyond what was necessary for her safety, had respected the boundaries she established even when they were inconvenient. The evidence suggested he was different from Devon in ways that mattered, or he was patient enough to earn trust before exploiting it. She could not tell which interpretation was accurate, and the uncertainty was exhausting enough that part of her wanted to simply surrender to whatever this was becoming and deal with consequences later. That impulse terrified her more than Devon's approaching arrival, because surrender was exactly how the last disaster had begun. Devon arrived in Seoul 6 days early, which meant either his travel plans had changed or the surveillance tracking him had been intentionally misled. Min Seo's security report arrived at 4 a.m. with confirmation that he had checked into the Shilla Hotel in Yonggu and had already made inquiries about Simone's last known address. The early arrival shattered Simone's fragile sense of having time to prepare. She'd been counting on 9 days to fortify her psychological defenses, to create distance from the dangerous intimacy developing with Tae-Min, to establish some semblance of control over a situation that had spiraled beyond her management. Instead, Devon was in Seoul right now, and the illusion of safety dissolved completely. Tae-Min was at her door within 20 minutes of the security alert, which meant he had either been awake or his team had protocols for waking him during emergencies involving her safety. The distinction mattered in ways Simone was too frightened to examine closely. His presence should have felt intrusive. Instead, it felt like the only solid thing in a reality that had become dangerously unstable. They reviewed the security footage together on Min Seo's tablet. Devon looked exactly as Simone remembered. Tall, conventionally handsome, carrying himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no in any way that mattered. He wore expensive casual clothes and smiled at the hotel staff with charm that made Simone's stomach turn, because she knew exactly what existed underneath that pleasant exterior. The footage showed him leaving the hotel alone, walking through Yonggu with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly where he was going. The surveillance team had maintained distance while tracking his movements through 3 different neighborhoods before he returned to his hotel. He was not behaving like a tourist. He was hunting. Simone felt her carefully maintained composure finally shatter completely. The clinical detachment that had allowed her to function through the escalating threat collapsed under the reality of seeing Devon's face again. Her breathing became erratic. Her hands shook badly enough that Tae-Min gently took the tablet from her before she dropped it. The panic attack was thorough and humiliating, made worse by the fact that it was happening in front of someone she was supposed to be therapeutically treating. The professional disaster of the situation registered somewhere in her consciousness, but could not compete with the primal terror of knowing her abuser was less than 5 kilometers away. Tae-Min's response cut through the panic with unexpected effectiveness. He did not try to calm her with platitudes or reassurances. Instead, he stated facts with absolute certainty. Devon could not access her building. He did not know her current location. He was being monitored continuously. Any attempt to approach her would be intercepted before contact occurred. She was safe in ways that were concrete and verifiable rather than hoped for. The logical framework helped more than comfort would have. Simone's breathing gradually steadied as she focused on the specific security measures rather than abstract fear. When she could speak again, she asked the question that had been building since accepting his protection. What would happen if Devon actually attempted contact? What were the consequences Min Seo had mentioned? Tae-Min's answer was careful and absolutely clear. Devon would be strongly discouraged from remaining in Seoul through methods that were legal but unmistakably serious. If he persisted, despite clear warnings, the discouragement would escalate until he understood that his continued presence in Korea carried costs he was not prepared to pay. The implication hung between them. Tae-Min was prepared to deploy resources that existed in moral and legal gray areas to ensure her safety. The protection she had accepted came with methods she had deliberately avoided examining too closely. She should have been horrified. Instead, she felt desperately, dangerously grateful. That gratitude terrified her almost as much as Devon's arrival, because it meant she had crossed a line she could not uncross. She had accepted not just protection, but the violence that protection might require. Had aligned herself with someone whose world operated by rules she had spent her career teaching people to escape. The war had arrived, and Simone was no longer certain which side she was on. Devon made his move on the third day of his sole visit, and the precision suggested he had either identified her location through means Min Seo's team had not anticipated or was working with information from someone inside her previous circles. He appeared at the Itaewon Wellness Center during what would have been her usual Thursday morning session time. The building's security footage captured him, charming his way past the front desk with the practiced ease Simone remembered too well. He'd always been exceptional at making people want to help him. Ji-woo had been alone in the office updating client files when he arrived. The surveillance audio picked up his warm greeting, his explanation that he was an old colleague of Dr. Grant's visiting Seoul unexpectedly. His hope that perhaps Simone might have time for coffee to catch up on old times. Ji-woo's response had been perfectly professional and appropriately cautious. Dr. Grant was on temporary leave for personal reasons. She could not provide contact information without permission. She would be happy to pass along a message if he would like to leave one. Devon's facade had cracked just slightly when his charm failed to achieve the desired result. The shift in his tone was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to listen for. A hint of irritation wrapped in manufactured concern, a suggestion that surely Ji-woo could make an exception for someone who had known Simone for so many years. The pressure tactics had been gentle enough to seem reasonable, while being insistent enough to make Ji-woo uncomfortable. Simone recognized the technique from countless personal experiences. The slow escalation that made you question whether you were being unreasonable for maintaining boundaries. Ji-woo had held firm and politely asked Devon to leave. His departure had been cordial, but the security footage showed him photographing the building's entrance on his way out. Min Seo's report arrived within the hour, along with a recommendation that escalated the situation significantly. Devon had demonstrated clear intent to locate Simone through her professional contacts. His behavior pattern suggested he would continue attempting access through any available channel. The threat assessment had been upgraded to immediate and active. The recommended response involved Devon receiving a visit from individuals who would make very clear that his continued presence in Seoul was unwelcome, and that any further attempts to contact Simone would result in consequences that extended beyond legal inconvenience. Simone sat in her apartment reading the clinical language describing what amounted to intimidation tactics, and found herself approving the recommendation without the moral conflict she should have felt. Devon had come to Seoul specifically to find her, had charmed and pressured her assistant, had demonstrated he would not be deterred by polite refusal or professional boundaries. The pattern was identical to how he had operated in New York before their relationship had deteriorated into violence. She had spent 3 years believing that distance and new identity would be sufficient protection. That belief had been naive in ways that could have cost her everything. Tae-Min appeared at her door that evening without the usual security alert, which meant he had bypassed his own protocols to check on her personally. His expression carried a gravity that made clear he understood the significance of what she had approved. He needed her explicit verbal confirmation before his people approached Devon. The decision had to be hers completely. Once made, the situation would escalate in ways that could not be easily reversed. Simone looked at the man who had somehow become her protection, her confidant, and possibly something she was still too afraid to name. She thought about Devon's face on the security footage, about Ji-woo's discomfort, about the 3 years she'd spent looking over her shoulder, waiting for exactly this moment. She gave the confirmation Tae-Min required, and in doing so accepted that she had fundamentally transformed into someone her past self would not recognize. The therapist who helped women escape dangerous men had just authorized dangerous men to protect her from danger. The irony was not lost on her, but survival rarely concerned itself with philosophical consistency. Devon received his warning at the Shilla Hotel bar at 11 that evening. Minseo's report arrived 90 minutes later with clinical precision that somehow made the encounter feel both more and less disturbing than Simone had anticipated. Two of Tae-Min's senior security personnel had approached Devon in a public setting, designed to appear coincidental. The conversation had been conducted in English with volume and tone carefully calibrated to avoid drawing attention while ensuring absolute clarity of message. They had identified themselves as representatives of interested parties who were aware of his presence in Seoul and his recent activities. They had explained with documented evidence that his inquiries about a particular American therapist had been noticed and were unwelcome. They had suggested strongly that his business in Seoul was concluded and that his departure would be in everyone's best interests. The language had been diplomatic enough to avoid explicit threats while leaving absolutely no ambiguity about consequences for continued investigation. Devon's response had been predictably defensive, followed by cautiously strategic. He had claimed innocent intentions of reconnecting with an old friend, had expressed confusion about why professional courtesy warranted such serious intervention, had attempted to position himself as the reasonable party being intimidated without cause. The performance had been skilled enough that it might have worked on people who did not have access to Simone's documented history of abuse, restraining orders, and the police reports from their final encounter that had required hospital treatment. Tae-Min's people had countered with specifics that made clear they knew exactly who Devon was and what he had done. They had mentioned the restraining order, referenced the assault charges that had been dropped only because Simone had fled rather than pursue prosecution, noted the pattern of harassment that had continued for months after her disappearance. The shift in Devon's demeanor when he realized the extent of their information had been captured on discreet surveillance. The charm had evaporated entirely, replaced by something colder and more calculating. He had asked who exactly was protecting Simone with this level of resources and interest. The response had been deliberately vague, but unmistakably threatening. Someone with considerably more reach than Devon possessed. Someone who took personal interest in ensuring that people who hurt women under their protection understood the error conclusively. Devon had been advised to check out of his hotel by morning and book the first available flight back to New York. He had been informed that his movements would be monitored continuously until his departure. He had been promised that any attempt to contact Simone, her colleagues, or anyone in her professional circle would result in escalation that he would find extremely unpleasant. The meeting had concluded with businesslike efficiency, and Devon had returned to his hotel room within 20 minutes. Simone read the report 3 times, trying to process the reality that Devon had been confronted with information about his abuse and told to leave the country by men working on her behalf. The situation felt simultaneously vindicating and deeply unsettling. She had spent 3 years wishing someone had intervened when Devon was destroying her. Had fantasized about his accountability being forced rather than voluntary. Had imagined scenarios where his behavior had consequences beyond her own suffering. Now that intervention had occurred, and she felt strangely hollow rather than relieved. Tae-Min arrived at her apartment an hour after she received the report, and his careful expression suggested he understood the complexity of her response better than she did herself. He confirmed that Devon had booked a flight departing the following afternoon. Surveillance would continue until his plane left Seoul. If he showed any indication of changing plans or attempting contact, the response would escalate significantly. The crisis was effectively resolved through methods that existed entirely outside legal systems and conventional accountability. Simone should have felt safe. Instead, she felt complicit in something she could not quite name. She had authorized intimidation, had approved surveillance, had aligned herself with people who solved problems through shows of force rather than proper channels. The therapist who had dedicated her career to helping people escape cycles of violence and control had become part of a different system that wielded both with calculated precision. The transformation felt complete and irreversible, and Simone was no longer certain whether she had been saved or simply changed hands from one form of captivity to another. Devon's flight departed Seoul at 2:15 the following afternoon. Minseo confirmed wheels up with the same clinical efficiency that had characterized every security report, and just like that, the immediate threat that had dominated Simone's life for 2 weeks ceased to exist. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt unmoored in ways that made no logical sense. The crisis had provided structure. Fear had given her days clear purpose. The threat had justified every boundary she had crossed and every compromise she had made. Without Devon's presence in Seoul, she was left examining the wreckage of her professional identity and personal autonomy without the excuse of immediate danger. Her practice remained suspended. Her clients had been transferred to another therapist. Her apartment was not hers but Tae-Min's property. Her safety depended entirely on security systems she did not control. Her daily existence operated within parameters someone else had established. The differences between her current situation and her relationship with Devon were significant. Tae-Min had not isolated her maliciously, had not undermined her career for personal gain, had not manipulated her emotions or gaslit her reality. His control had been implemented for protection rather than domination. But control was still control, and dependence was still dependence, and Simone could not escape the growing awareness that she had traded one form of captivity for another that was simply more benevolent in its execution. Tae-Min's therapy session that week carried a weight neither of them acknowledged directly. They sat in her living room maintaining the fiction of professional boundaries, while both understanding that their relationship had transformed into something that made therapeutic objectivity impossible. He had been processing the encounter with Devon, he explained. Watching his security team deliver warnings had forced him to confront how easily he could deploy intimidation when properly motivated. The realization that he possessed his father's capacity for calculated threat had been disturbing in ways that felt genuinely uncomfortable rather than performed. Simone found herself responding as something other than his therapist. She pointed out that possessing capacity for violence was different from wielding it indiscriminately, that using resources to protect someone from genuine harm was not morally equivalent to using those same resources for exploitation or control. The conversation felt less like therapy and more like two people trying to justify choices that had irrevocably altered who they were. By session's end, they had arrived at an unspoken understanding. The therapeutic relationship could not continue in its current form. The boundaries had collapsed too completely. The personal entanglement was too profound. Tae-Min suggested termination, with referral to another therapist who could provide appropriate clinical distance. The recommendation was professionally correct and personally devastating, because it meant acknowledging that what existed between them now had nothing to do with therapy, and everything to do with something neither of them knew how to categorize. Simone agreed to the termination because maintaining the pretense had become untenable. What she did not agree to was his assumption that ending therapy meant ending their connection entirely. The admission hung between them like a confession. She was choosing him, not as a client, not as a protective arrangement, but as someone who had seen her at her most terrified and responded with care that felt genuine enough to risk believing in. The choice terrified her because it meant accepting that she had fundamentally changed, that the woman who had fled New York determined to never again depend on anyone had become someone who was choosing dependence with full awareness of the risk. Tae-Min's response was characteristically direct. He wanted her to be certain. wanted her to understand that choosing him meant accepting his world with all its moral complications. Wanted her to have time without crisis pressure to consider whether this decision was based on genuine feeling or trauma, bonding born from shared intensity. His insistence on her agency felt like the clearest evidence that he was different from Devon in ways that actually mattered. Simone told him she needed a week, space to process without his presence, time to determine whether what she felt was real or simply exhaustion dressed up as connection. He agreed immediately and left her apartment with the understanding that the next move would be entirely hers. For the first time in 2 weeks, Simone was alone with her thoughts and no immediate crisis to distract from the fundamental question of who she had become and whether that transformation was tragedy or evolution. 7 days of solitude clarified what Simone had been too afraid to examine during the crisis. She spent the week rebuilding routines that belonged to her alone. Morning runs through Itaewon without security shadows she could detect. Coffee at cafes where no one monitored her movements. Evenings reading clinical journals and reconnecting with the professional identity she had nearly lost. Min Seo's security remained present but invisible, which Simone recognized as Tae-Min, honoring his promise of space while ensuring her safety continued. The balance felt significant. She called Ji-woo midweek and had the honest conversation she should have initiated weeks ago. Her assistant deserved to know that the practice closure was not temporary, that Simone was reevaluating everything about her life in Seoul, that the past month had fundamentally changed her in ways that made returning to previous patterns impossible. Ji-woo's response had been unexpectedly understanding. She had suspected something significant was happening beyond simple security concerns. She hoped Simone would find whatever clarity she needed. The practice would be fine. The clients were adjusting. Life continued even when individual pieces transformed. By day 6, Simone had reached a conclusion that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She had spent 3 years building a life defined by independence and professional boundaries because those structures felt safe after Devon's destruction. But safety built entirely on isolation was just another form of prison. She had been so afraid of repeating past mistakes that she had nearly missed recognizing when someone offered genuine partnership rather than disguised control. Tae-Min was not Devon. The evidence was overwhelming once she stopped filtering every action through trauma-colored lenses. He had resources that could have controlled her completely yet consistently prioritized her agency, had power that could have manipulated yet chose transparency about his world's moral complications, had opportunity to exploit her vulnerability yet responded with patience that allowed her space to choose freely. The difference was not that he lacked capacity for control, but that he actively refused to exercise it despite having every opportunity. That refusal was everything. On the 7th evening, Simone stood at her apartment window overlooking Seoul's endless lights and acknowledged a truth that felt like stepping off a cliff. She wanted the life that choosing Tae-Min would create, not despite its complications, but including them. Not as escape from loneliness, but as genuine partnership with someone who had seen her at her worst and responded with care that felt worth the risk. She texted him a single sentence asking if his offer still stood. His response arrived within seconds, always. They met at a restaurant in Gangnam that felt appropriately neutral, somewhere public enough to feel safe, private enough for honest conversation. Tae-Min arrived looking uncertain in ways his performance training usually concealed, and the vulnerability felt like its own form of truth. Simone laid out her terms with the clarity she had spent 7 days developing. She would not return to therapy practice immediately. She needed time to rediscover professional identity separate from crisis management. She would accept his protection but not his control. She would build a life that included him, but was not defined entirely by that inclusion. She would require honesty about his world's darkness and agency in deciding what she could accept. His agreement came without negotiation, because he understood what she was offering. not dependence disguised as partnership, but genuine choice made with full awareness of complexity. 3 months later, Simone reopened her practice in a new location with security measures that felt protective rather than restrictive. Her client list rebuilt gradually with women who needed exactly the expertise she had gained through surviving both Devon and the complicated process of learning to trust again. Tae-Min continued his own therapeutic work with a new counselor, processing the systematic training that had shaped him while building capacity for authentic connection. His business operations remained morally gray, but he had established boundaries around what he would accept even when profitable alternatives existed. They built a relationship that defied easy categorization, not therapist and client, not protector and protected. Something more complicated and honest. Two people who had seen each other's capacity for darkness and chosen partnership anyway. Simone's mother had told her once that healing was not about erasing damage, but about integrating it into something stronger. She finally understood what that meant. She was not the woman who had fled New York, was not the therapist who had arrived in Seoul 3 years ago, was not even the person who had accepted Tae-Min's protection during crisis. She was someone new, someone who had survived trauma, accepted imperfect help, made morally complicated choices, and emerged with agency intact and vision clearer. The transformation had been painful and messy, and nothing like the clean narrative she had once imagined healing should follow. But it was hers, chosen consciously, built deliberately, and that made all the difference. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to see more stories.